Wonderful.
Good. I can't see myself anymore, but guess I'm here.
You look wonderful. Don't worry.
Oh, thank you.
So if you want to share your presentation, we can test and see if that works.
Okay, sure. Hold on. It said you should say present now.
Yeah, exactly. And you should be able to, either just present your whole screen or select a part.
Okay, I have to open my system preferences for some reason.
That's strange.
Okay.
Oh dear.
Sorry, I had to go log out in order to change my permissions.
Sure.
Okay, let me see, present now. The entire screen.
Yes, very good.
Okay.
Yep.
Great.
Let's give it like 2 more minutes for everyone to join, and then we'll start off. Okay, I guess we might as well get started. So hello everyone, welcome to the Slate Codex Meetup. Joshua couldn't make it this week, so you're stuck with me. Our speaker today is going to be Diana Fleischman, who is an evolutionary psychologist currently writing a book called How to Train Your Boyfriend, Integrating Evolutionary Psychology and Behaviorism. Diana has published extensively on discussed human sexuality and evolutionary psychology more broadly. So we're gonna let her have a talk, and we're gonna have Q&A afterwards. During the talk, if you want to ask a question, please preface the question in chat with Q: and your question, and I will then read out the questions afterwards after the talk. So without further ado, Diana, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Hold on. Okay. Okay, so I'm Diana Fleischman. I am writing a book called How to Train Your Boyfriend, but it's not going to say integrating evolutionary psychology and behaviorism because that would scare away. anyone who wanted to read a How to Train Your Boyfriend book. So the idea just came to me, this idea about integrating evolutionary psychology and behaviorism, back when I was in graduate school, and I read Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And if you haven't read Beyond Freedom and Dignity, it's really amazing. I highly recommend it. And I always thought that evolutionary psychology and behaviorism were sort of counterindicated to one another. Behaviorism has this idea that there's kind of a general purpose sort of learning module, that everything can be learned with this sort of general purpose module, whereas evolutionary psychology thinks about the mind more in terms of kind of specific programs, as in, long-term goals, short-term goals, sexuality, food, what kind of moral loopholes you can get through, and what things you have to stand by in terms of your identity. So these things are connected to greater and lesser extents, but certainly behaviorism has a different idea. But I think people kind of overstate how much behaviorism underestimates genetic influences. So, Skinner did believe in evolution. He believed that evolution influenced psychology, including of non-human animals. And he certainly thought that there were genetic influences. He just thought that there was somewhat less so. I think he would probably think that there are more genetic influences than the average psychologist today, actually. So the first idea in terms of this integration that I'm talking about is something called the extended phenotype. So basically all of us are trying all the time, to influence other people. And Dawkins came up with this idea of the extended phenotype back in the 90s, or maybe even the 80s. And the extended phenotype, he was saying, is that, in terms of evolution, what evolution sees, it's not just the bodies of the organism itself, but also other things. So evolution selects on a beaver's dam, on a bee's hive, and also on the bodies and brains of those organisms. But an extension of this is that the extended phenotype is also how our minds influence other minds. So not just the kinds of homes and structures that we create, but also the influence that we have on others. So the extended phenotype here in the bottom panel, something like this hairworm, is a very simple organism. Actually, if you look at parasites, they're really simple, but they can have very complex psychological effects on their hosts. So this hairworm wants to be in a...
Diana.
Yeah.
Diana, sorry, we can't see your slides.
Oh, no.
Yeah, sorry, must have lost them somewhere.
Okay. Stop sharing, carry on sharing. Okay, present now.
Excellent. Thank you.
You can see it again. I can't see it, but that's fine.
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, cool. So in terms of, just let me know. It said that there was an error. So in terms of evolutionary influences, these organisms are very simple themselves, but they have very complex, they have an extended phenotype into the minds of others. And this cordyceps in the upper right-hand corner, also a very simple fungal organism, doesn't even have a mind of its own, but it can influence various different insects. So each cordyceps has a host, and in this case, it's an ant, and it sort of drives the ant up very high as far as possible in order to release its spores. So some organisms are very simple. They make a living by having a very complex influence on other organisms. And you also see this in terms of the influence that organisms have on members of their same species. So for a long time, people thought that mothers and infants had this incredibly harmonious interaction, but now we know something called fetal offspring conflict, and we know that actually mothers and infants are very much in conflict. A lot of the problems that mothers have during pregnancy, even including those problems that can threaten her life, are problems that are induced by the embryo or the fetus. And the fetus also influences the mother in terms of her, potentially her behavior and her food preferences in other complex ways that we don't 100% understand. And similarly, if you look at men and women also can have an extended phenotypic effect on each other. So men and women try to influence each other's minds in a way that's an extension. And you see this in other organisms as well. In a recent article I wrote, I talked about something called the Bruce effect, where a female mouse smells a male mouse's pheromones, and if she's pregnant, she will immediately absorb the pregnancy or miscarry because of the male pheromones indicate that there's a new male around. And you can think about that as an adaptation in the female, but you can also consider that sort of an extended phenotypic effect of the male on the female. So this kind of gets to a very core idea in evolutionary psychology, which is something called hold on a second. Give me just a second. I'm actually I'm in the right presentation. Okay, cool. So this is strategic facilitation and interference. And the idea basically here is that every other, good, can you see me? Yeah.
Yes, everything looks good.
Everything's good. So strategic facilitation is like other people are trying to sometimes help you and sometimes hurt you in various different ways. So for example, if I have this strong desire that other people around me are going to think that I'm a moral and consistent person, and then we are out, to dinner and my husband makes it sound like I change my mind all the time and he talks about the worst thing I've ever done, I'm going to be angry with him because he's interfering with my strategy of trying to present myself in this particular way that will make people want to interact with me. Whereas if he tells a story about how I raised 100 orphans or something, then that's facilitating my strategy of trying to be a good, presented as a good person. So we can have all of these different strategies and people are trying to sometimes cooperate with us. Sometimes they're defecting against us. Sometimes it's in their best interest to cooperate with us. And so there's this reason for us to try and interfere with other strategies and for us to also try and influence other people's behavior. So strategic facilitation is when other people are enabling your strategies, and strategy can be anything really distal, like far off, like increasing your reproductive success, or proximate, have sex, require resources, whatever, signal a positive trait. And certainly if somebody's curated a strong identity, signaling that identity becomes a very strong strategy as well, in terms of how much people want to have cachet in a given sort of group. So all of these are ideas, and it doesn't really matter if you yourself, I think this is something that other people get, sort of normies get confused about, but I don't imagine Slate Star Codex people would get confused about, is that you can be somebody who never wants to have children or never wants to have a significant long-term relationship and still have these evolved strategies and still have these this kind of software in place. So I think it doesn't matter exactly what you've decided to do consciously. I think all this stuff is still in the back of our minds. So I have something I call the evolved trainer. In the book, I call it the alpha. And it's the idea that we've evolved to shape others to facilitate our adaptive strategies and to prevent conflict with our adaptive strategies. And this is kind of where evolutionary psychology and behaviorism become integrated. The basic idea is that we have this ability to punish and reinforce other people, and that this kind of complicated behaviorist technique, it's not always complicated, but this way that we've learned how to train other organisms is something that's instantiated in all of our minds. But because it's largely unconscious, we're not always doing it in the most effective way possible, and certainly not always in keeping with our own ethical, moral goals and with our identities. So oftentimes we're trying to change other people's behaviors in ways that may not actually make a lot of sense. So this talk is going to be kind of about different ways that I think behavior is changed, looking at different animals, also looking at humans, and thinking about actually, how we can harness this gift that we have for the good and try to prevent it from doing too much damage to ourselves and to others. So a few kind of behaviorist concepts that we can start off with are things like classical conditioning. That's pairing a reinforcing stimulus with a neutral stimulus. And this is something like clicker training. If any of you have dogs or even cats, I had a cat that was clicker trained. You can pair a reinforcing stimulus with a neutral stimulus. So you give your dog a treat every time you give the dog a click with the clicker, and then eventually the click itself becomes reinforcing. And that's important, as I'll go on to talk about a little bit later, is that the reward immediately after the behavior is the most important thing. If you let a few seconds go by, the reward becomes less reinforcing. Similarly with punishment. Operant conditioning is the strength of a behavior is modified by its consequences. So if a behavior is followed up by a very strong reinforcer or something very punishing, that's basically operant conditioning. How much a behavior is increased in frequency or decreased in frequency based on its consequences. And there's also things called reinforcement schedules. These are things like, are you getting a reinforcement every time you do the behavior, every 10th time, every 10 minutes, or at a random interval? And this is also something that we do as humans, I think, without really knowing what we're doing, that we often give random reinforcement schedules because they're very helpful in terms of making behavior prolonged. And I'll talk a little bit about that later too. There's also shaping. So shaping is the behaviorist principle of trying to get a behavior from nothing. So you start off with, if you have a dog and you want the dog to sit, ideally you would give the dog a treat and a reward just for thinking about sitting, and then for having his butt close to the ground, and then for having his butt all the way on the ground. So this is where you get a behavior to develop over time. And people do this as well with one another. I think that we are inclined to try and figure out if somebody is thinking about doing something that would be good for us or bad for us. So I think that we often, as humans, try to shape one another, even when it comes to just thoughts. And then a jackpot is a really large reward that's given in the case of a behavior that you want, oftentimes when that behavior is unexpected. Like, let's say you've never seen somebody do a very complex behavior before, or an animal do a very complex behavior before, and they do it kind of out of nowhere. You want to give them, if they're a dolphin, the whole bucket of fish. If they're a husband, a big kiss and hug. If they're an employee, you want to tell them great job and give them the day off. You want to jackpot that behavior. So these are all different ways of getting to behaviors that you want. And these are just elements of operant conditioning, just in case it's surprising to me, actually, very few people nowadays learn about behaviorism at all when they get any kind of psychology training. And sometimes it's just one day, even though it was actually the foremost theory of psychology for a really long time. It had a much, I think, longer heyday than pretty much anything else. So I think the lingo is a little bit confusing, but positive reinforcements when you add something, negative reinforcements when you take something that's bad away. Punishment is when you add a punishment. So it's sometimes called positive punishment. So hitting somebody, even though that doesn't sound very nice, that's positive punishment. And then there's omission training, which is like taking away something good, like grounding somebody or locking them in a closet or something. And these things are really, really powerful. If you have time in the near future, I recommend that you watch some videos from this. There's this fish called Erasmus, the clicker-trained fish. And because fish don't really have much in the way of ears, he gets clicker-trained with a flash of white light. And his trainer, Ilana, trained him to do the limbo, to play with a little soccer ball. And she's got a compilation video of all of his different tricks that she shaped him to do. But one really surprising thing that you might not expect about fish, and it's quite a testament to the power of these techniques, is that she trained him, this cichlid fish, how to do something really creative. So when people think about behaviorism, they think, oh, you can just train somebody to do like a rote behavior. But actually what she did is she gave him this rubber band, and every time he did something new with it, she gave him a treat. So she actually sort of meta rewarded creativity itself. And you can watch that video too, where he does something different with it, every minute. And sometimes he's in such a flow state, no pun intended, even though he's a fish, he actually doesn't want to get his treat until he's done with the behavior that he's created. And if you think about dolphin training, dolphins actually came up with a lot of their own tricks with this kind of reinforcement schedule. So here I'm just trying to kind of dispel one myth about behaviorism, in that it has very simple consequences. You can make very complex things happen, even things that you don't even know that you want happen with these simple behaviorist kinds of techniques. So this kind of gets on to how does this actually instantiate itself in relationships? How does it actually happen that these techniques and things manifest when we have interpersonal relationships? So if you think about strategic interference and strategic facilitation, this is going to be super, super important in pair bonds. So if there's two organisms and they're, male and female, they're trying to raise offspring together, it's really important, if you look at a monogamous species like these lovebirds, that they shape each other to do what they need to do to lay eggs, even if the behaviors are in both of their interests. It actually makes sense evolutionarily for there to be a learning mechanism also on top of that. So even if the female is inclined to sit on the eggs and feed the babies, it still makes sense for them to be mutually reinforcing each other for these behaviors. And so the idea is that the evolved trainer should be especially strong in contexts of shared genetic fate, and also sensitive to expectations about repeated interactions, how sensitive the target is at training, and how much motivation the target has. So these are things that I think would have gone into the considerations of training. And granted, this is all very much unconscious. And so I'll show you a speculation that I have about the only species that is known of monogamous tree frogs. So these are mimic poison arrow frogs. And I saw a BBC documentary where I definitely thought that they were training each other. So they have a very complex behavior they have to engage in, especially given that they're frogs. So the female lays fertilized eggs in these different palm fronds. And when the egg hatches and a tadpole emerges, the only thing the tadpole can eat is the unfertilized eggs of the mother, which is a pretty weird life history. So the mother comes by, she lays an unfertilized egg, and the baby eats it. So the male, his job in this monogamous species is to go and check on the tadpoles to see if they're hungry. If they're hungry, they do this wiggle waggle dance. And then to get the mother, get her to lay an egg and feed her baby. And so I watched this documentary. You can see this, I think, also on YouTube. And the mother lays this on, the mother sees the tadpole is hungry. The male is chirping at her in a specific way. And then she tries to go away without feeding him for some reason. So the male goes after her. He's got different kinds of chirps, very high-pitched chirps that he gives her. And immediately after she lays the unfertilized egg for the tadpole, he covers her with his body in this particular way. It kind of looks like a cuddle. And this is me wildly anthropomorphizing the frog, saying, because you fed our babies, I'm going to give you cues of proximity and security that you find reinforcing. This is my idea of what the male frog is saying to the female frog from a behaviorist perspective. So for small organisms that can get predated upon, being covered up is very probably reinforcing as a stimuli. Looking at another pair bonded species, these are zebra finches, and they did a really funny experiment with these zebra finches. So the male and the female, they nest together and they both take care of their offspring. And they have a time that they sit on the nest and make sure that the babies are warm. So the male goes off, and they have these 30-minute increments. The male goes away for 30 minutes and then the female goes away for 30 minutes, and they can forage and come back. Anyway, there was a group of ornithologists who did something a little bit funny, and they took the male when he flew away from the nest, and they kept him away from the female. And they kept him away, I think something like half an hour longer than he was supposed to be gone. So instead of being gone for half an hour, he was gone for an hour. And when the male and the female get back together, they generally sing a duet together. So they sing this duet that is kind of like, yeah, everything's cool, everything's fine. Well, the duet changes a lot when the male was late. So when the male was late, the female, actually her duet became very different. And if the male actually didn't make up for the silent space in the duet, so she actually didn't sing quite as much, the female, the next time she would go away, would actually also leave for longer and come back later. So I think that this is an example of a kind of consequence that the female is leveraging against the male in this scenario as well, in case, as a kind of form of punishment. Kind of looking at more pair bonded species, another thing that you would expect kind of from a behaviorist perspective is that animals will learn what other animals find rewarding and what they find punishing. So for humans, like, we don't really know, before you get to know somebody, you don't know 100% what they find rewarding and what they find punishing. People are really unique and different. And you see this a little bit in different bird species. So on the left of the superb bird of paradise, he's doing his thing. The female is assessing him, and then they mate. But on the right are Eurasian jays, and they're much more a monogamous pair-bonded kind of species. And so what they found in these different pair-bonded bird species is that in the particular case, they were looking at males. Males were actually better at figuring out what the female wanted to eat. So they did an experiment where they showed the female getting one food over and over and over again. A wax moth larva, I think, is what they showed the female getting over and over again. And when the male saw this and he was offered a chance to feed her something, he would actually feed her something different. So generally these birds, they prefer variety if they're eating the same thing over and over again. And so the male figured out above chance levels that the female's preference was to eat something different. So this is another, I think, aspect of, if you're thinking about the evolved trainer or the alpha, the part of us that is evolved to train other people or to shape their behavior would actually have a strong motivation to know each other's preferences, but also, what the other individual finds most punishing and most aversive as well. So if you look at preference memory in humans, it looks like a huge amount of our memory is devoted to remembering the preferences and aversions of others. And in my view, we use this to kind of generate customized shaping regimes and schedules for other people. And we experiment to see how other people respond to punishment, to different schedules of reinforcement, and to extinction. And I think a lot of this happens kind of unconsciously. We're just seeing if we're getting what we want from the behavior, in terms of behavior, given what we're given. And I think that if you think about language, if you think about talking, praise, compliments, stories, certain kinds of touch and embraces and food and facial expressions, it actually starts to make more sense about why we are emoting all the time to each other, because we want to emote to each other in terms of punishing and reinforcing each other immediately after the behavior that we want or don't want happens. If you let even a second pass, then that is going to be much less effective. And so it makes sense that these things would be, I think, largely unconscious. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So, if you look at a cat has a certain kind of preferences. They like warmth, they like sleeping, they like food. Cats have very straightforward kind of preferences, but humans have very idiosyncratic preferences. Some people like eye contact, some people like makeup, some people like strong perfume. Some people like, I have an Irish friend who is very annoyed by this beer with too much head on it. Some people like touch or sunsets, right? So people have very different preferences. And I have this speculation that, why do we have such idiosyncratic preferences? It makes it actually much harder for us to be unlocked by other people. If we have this variation among us, somebody has to know us fairly well if they're going to be able to reinforce and punish us. Everybody almost likes, smiles and certain kinds of touch and sex and food. But there's so much variation among people in what they specifically prefer or find aversive. So the next kind of characteristic I talk about in terms of the evolved trainer is something that we can call encapsulation. So we often don't want other people to know about our adaptive strategies. Indicating reasons for punishment and reinforcement can cause others to resist. This was called counter control by Skinner. So you often see this if there's some indication that somebody's giving that they have some power over you, you can resist that and in turn punish that person. This is often what we see, I think, with children who are very difficult to get in any kind of behavioral control. Children who have oppositional defiance disorder or whatever, for them, actually being praised becomes a form of punishment because they are so committed to not having their strategies interfered with. So we don't want people to know about our adaptive strategy, and we indicate what we actually want that can cause other people to resist. So the idea here is that, we're not actually aware of what we're doing when we reward and punish other people, especially when we punish other people, because punishment is so strongly maligned. And, when people get angry with each other or do terrible things to each other, you often hear people saying, I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to make you angry. I didn't have these intentions. And honestly, if you yell at somebody, you may not have meant to consciously hurt them, but that is actually what the behavior's end goal really is. So we don't want people to know that we have these kind of antisocial motivations, that we are trying to control them. So we actually tend to, I think, encapsulate these ideas. And that's, I think, part of, just to talk personally about the resistance to some of these ideas that people have, is people don't want to think that they are, in fact, trying to control other people in these various ways, especially because the ways that we try to control other people aren't always very effective, or they can be really counterproductive, as I'll talk more about. So if I think about emotions from the point of view of behaviorism, they are, why do we kind of emote all the time? Why do we have so little, many people have so little control over our kind of facial expressions? And oftentimes we emote, even when we're alone. We actually have more control over our expressions than some other animals. So chimpanzees, for example, they don't have conscious control over their food calls. There's a famous case of Jane Goodall talking about how a female put her own hand over her mouth so that she could hide that there was a cache of food from other chimps for a little while, because she didn't actually have conscious control over her food call. So in my view, anger and outrage are what I would call punishment hunger. These motivate memory for how to punish the person or the individual we want to punish, and they target the punishment at the behavior that we want to target. Sadness can also be used as punishment for people who care about us. It can be used to elicit responses for reinforcement. It can create a flurry of behavior that we can then reinforce. Surprise and gratitude and happiness can motivate memory for the specific reinforcement, the best thing that the person likes, and the reinforce the target, depending on kind of expectation. So that can result in a jackpot. If somebody does something for us out of the blue that's really kind and is very much facilitating our strategies, then you want to jackpot that person. And I think a surprise gratitude actually causes that very quick, very immediate, large-scale reward that we want to give somebody if they do what we want. So punishment, I'm going to move on to punishment now, but you guys can ask questions about any of these ideas at the end. But punishment is very controversial in behaviorism. So I think around the 60s, behaviorists, they wanted to say that punishment didn't work. And they pointed out all these different problems with punishment, because they said, they were often pacifists, they were often anti-war activists, and they were often against cruel imprisonment. And their basic idea, I think, was that, if you don't endorse punishment, then people might stop doing it. They might think it's less effective. People might stop waging war on each other or imprisoning people in these specific ways if we say punishment isn't effective. I certainly don't think that some large-scale aggressive encounters, or especially jail, which often occurs so long after the behavior it's basically useless, are necessarily effective. But punishment itself is really effective. And I think that punishment is generally the first way that we think about how to change behavior of others. So punishment just takes less attention and time than using iterated rewards. If I think about wanting to change someone's behavior to make them more thoughtful, I might consider, being really rewarding and praising anytime they do something thoughtful, or I could just yell at them every time they're thoughtless. So it's very difficult, given that there were attention and time constraints on us throughout evolutionary history, to think about shaping as a first course of action. I think other than with children, when people are interacting with babies and children, they often shape, I think, very naturally. But when it comes to other adults, I think we have trouble figuring out how to shape their behavior. So animals punish other animals when they're in pain, and organisms punish each other. Parental organisms, like there's actually I read somewhere that mother koalas spank baby koalas if they put themselves in danger. So corporal punishment is super common, and animals punish each other all the time. So there's a study that was done where they actually took one rat and they tied him up in the middle of a cage, and then they had the other rat scurrying around, and they electrified the bottom of the cage. And what happened when the bottom of the cage was electrified was that the one rat who was running around started attacking the rat that was tied up, because that rat inferred that that other rat was causing the physical pain and was, in some sense, had electrified the grid. It's because punishment isn't really rational that we engage in it so quickly, because we don't have time to think about whether or not we're going to engage in punishment. You want to engage in it as quickly as possible. So there was this really cool study about married couples. So I'm saying here that we punish others in context where intentional harm is ambiguous. And the best example of this is this one study where they had couples, brought them together, and they had them record whether or not they got into arguments. And the other thing that they did in this study was they gave each member of the couple a voodoo doll where they could put pins in the other. And the best predictor of whether or not couples yelled at each other and got into an angry dispute, and also how many pins they put into the voodoo doll of their partner, was their glucose level. So it looks like if you're hungrier, you're more likely to punish each other when your glucose is low. And that sort of speaks to a kind of a target difficulty. We don't understand that the other person is not responsible for us being hungry. We are in pain or in some discomfort, and then we lash out at the first person who's around. And this happens all the time. We feel bad or we lose something, and then we decide to punish the person who's closest by just in case they are responsible and they're actually interfering with us strategically. I'm not going to get into this, but you see this even more so in the case of places that believe in witchcraft. Anything bad that befalls you can be because of the volition of another person and can be punished in return. So this is kind of, I think, kind of an error management perspective that you can consider this, right? The target is engaged in an act where punishment would be effective. I don't know if you guys are familiar with error management, but just in brief, you can also call it something like the smoke detector principle. If you have a smoke detector, you would like it to go off sometimes when there's no fire, rather than have it not go off when there is a fire. So one kind of mistake, not going off when there is a fire, is less costly than another kind of mistake. Or that's more costly than the other mistake, which is going off when there is no fire. And I think this is similar to kind of punishment in that we don't want to miss an opportunity to punish a behavior that we don't like. And so, especially in contexts where we don't, where the stakes are low, I think in cultures where people literally kill each other, the error management might look somewhat different. But in terms of our culture and society, it does seem that it makes more sense to punish somebody, even if they didn't do anything consciously, or even if punishment's going to be ineffective, because we don't want to miss that opportunity. So here is the kind of layout of that. And you see this all the time, people are punishing each other when they're hungry. People punish their children for doing things like wetting the bed or not eating their dinner, context in which punishment is really ineffective for the most part. Okay, so one idea that we can talk about when it comes to people trying to change each other's behavior all the time is dyadic evolution. So where each organism is trying to get better. And this is an example, like if you look at cheetahs and gazelles get faster, cheetahs get faster until neither one can get any faster. And I think the same thing happens with humans. We're getting better and better at trying to change each other's behavior. But that also involves less awareness oftentimes of how we're trying to change each other's behavior, because for the most part, that awareness is going to undermine our abilities. So here's just kind of my ideas about men and women. So my view actually is that women are somewhat better at changing the behavior of men than men are at changing the behavior of women. And there's a few reasons for this that I'll go into, which makes up some of the kind of introduction of how to train your boyfriend. So one idea is that women just had a lot more to lose when it came to changing the behavior of others. So throughout evolutionary history, women were often around men who were aggressive and who had bad intentions either towards them or towards their children. Stepfathers are very likely to kill offspring. And so a woman didn't really have this recourse to force or physical force that a man had. Women had to train their children to get along and also to not hurt each other, especially in contexts where children are half siblings. This could have been really important, but even in contexts where kids are full siblings, any of you in the audience who have a sibling, you probably had at least one interaction where you severely hurt each other or were aggressive towards each other at some point. And so parents, especially mothers, have to try and prevent children from aggressing against each other, because ideally her strategy is to keep all of her children. Whereas for a sibling, especially if they want more resources, that's not necessarily the case. And women have very different kinds of social groups than men do. They're much more fluid. They're much less hierarchical. And so women often engage in indirect aggression and gossip. There's a great paper about that I'm going to blog about soon. But women had a lot more fluid encounters with other women. And they were often surrounded by strangers. Throughout evolutionary history, women were more likely to be transported to a new group as opposed to being around family. And so these were all really complicated scenarios. So my view is basically that women's evolved trainer has been under greater selection pressure. Women can't use force as easily or physical threats to compel others to do what they want as easily as men. The stakes for training are higher for women. So they're trying to train their mates to not harm their offspring. They're trying to train their mates, in many places, the highest status men would have more than one wife. And that is a very difficult training problem, to try and get a man to give you more resources than his other wives and to take better care of your children than the children from his other wives potentially, or other mates. You want to train your kids to not kill each other. And also there's another kind of selection pressure here, a sexual selection pressure, in that men might have been really interested in having a woman who was good at training other people. For a long-term partner, he might want a woman who trains the kids to get along well in the world and to not kill each other, who trains high status people to be good to them. And one of the best ways to assess how good a woman is at training is to see how well she trains you, especially if you are actively resisting it. That's an interesting potential idea, is that through resistance, people are actually testing out the training ability of others in that way. I mean, there is just normal resistance too, of course. So, are there kind of training design features in women? Can we think about some of the sex differences between men and women as actual ways that they are, training characteristics? So one thing that is different between men and women is something that's called emotional lability. That is that women tend to shift mood more quickly than men do. And these quick mood shifts, in my view, are a feature and actually not a bug. So if you can shift your mood quickly, you're going to be able to reward and punish behavior much more quickly when it occurs. And everybody knows that children are really mercurial, and they are volatile as well. They change very quickly from moment to moment. And it's important, if you're going to train your kids, that you can also have a very ability to quick shift. There's a lot of evidence that women are better at making facial expressions, that they have more facial expressiveness. And there's some good evidence that they're more sensitive to facial expressions and nonverbal cues of pleasure and pain. The evidence on this is somewhat mixed. There's some interesting evidence now that women are better at identifying facial expressions, but men are much better at identifying bodily expressions of different emotions. And I can point you guys to that paper if you want to read it. It's out of London. I can't remember, Gary something. Anyway, so facial expressions can be used to punish or reinforce, and recognizing expressions is really important to figure out if you have gotten the result that you want, to see if somebody's been reinforced or punished by your particular behavior. Women might be better at remembering the preferences and aversions of others. I'll talk about this more in a second. Women are much better at buying gifts than men are on average. And then women also have a good autobiographical memory. They're better able at remembering stuff that happened in a kind of narrative fashion, which might be helpful. One thing that I have speculated about is that people talk a lot about, why do humans have extended sexuality? So other primates don't have sex all the time, even bonobos do, but most other primates have sex when they're fertile and they don't have sex all the time. Whereas human women have sex sometimes before puberty, sometimes well after menopause, when they're pregnant, at all these different times. And this actually seems like it would be a really effective way of rewarding others is by using sex. And this seems to be somewhat the way that bonobos use it as well. And I have a paper about that. It's called A Behaviorist Perspective on Orgasm that you can check out. So is there any, evidence for, the kind of sex differences stuff that I'm talking about? One of the best pieces of evidence that I found is this paper called Marriage as a Training Ground, which followed 141 couples over 4 years. And the gist of this is basically that husband self-control was associated with women's or wives' forgiveness. So women who were lower in forgiveness at the beginning of the marriage, they showed higher level of forgiveness as husbands increased in self-control. But they didn't actually find that husbands' forgiveness was associated with wife's self-control. And if you think about these things from behaviorist perspective, so you think about forgiveness as negative reinforcement. That is, you take away something bad, so it's rewarding. So when you take away anger and disapproval, that ends up being a reward. So it's a way of using negative reinforcement. And lack of forgiveness, that is staying angry with somebody, is a form of punishment long-term. I don't think that these are necessarily very effective. I don't think that silent treatment is very effective, for example. But it does seem that women were having more of an influence on their husband's personality change over the course of these 4 years than men were having on women, which it didn't seem that they had any influence at all, vice versa, as in men on women. So, if you look at interpersonal relationships from this kind of behaviorist perspective, a lot of times people say to me, oh, Diana, I don't really see this in my relationship. I'm just nice to my boyfriend all the time, and he's nice to me. And, we frolic together in the rainbow. And I think that a lot of people who don't really see these concepts at work in their relationships are often still in a kind of courtship period. And courtship is really wonderful for all these reasons. So, and when people are engaging in courtship, they really don't tend to use punishment with each other. I mean, there are some very volatile early stage relationships, but oftentimes people in courtship, they just have really nice experiences together. They talk all the time, they share all the time, they have sex all the time. And this is really a way of putting in a really solid foundation, I think, for later possible behavior change. So I think the power of positive association develops a classical conditioning can be used for later training. What do I mean by this? I mean, if somebody has associated the kind of in-love feelings that they have with someone's smell, with their face, with their touch, with everything about them, then by simply withdrawing that, by simply giving somebody a blank face or walking away from them, that becomes very punishing. So it really compounds the influence of that person's ability to reward and punish behavior during that kind of courtship period. You can learn somebody's preferences and aversions, things that bother them, things that don't bother them. What's the worst possible thing that you could say to them? What's the nicest possible thing that you could say to them? What is it that they love to be complimented on? What's the core part of their identity? What is it that they want to become? There's a whole literature on this about how people can help each other become more like the person they want to become. There's this unconditional positive regard. So Skinner and other people talked about the therapeutic relationship, the relationship of the patient and the psychologist, for example. And if you go see a psychologist, they give you kind of non-contingent reinforcement. They just reinforce you all the time for showing up and for being there, and they're very nice to you no matter what you say. And I think that's kind of what courtship is like. When you do that, when you're just constantly positive, you see a full possible behavioral repertoire. You see a lot of behavior from somebody when you do that, because none of it is being held back by the possibility of punishment. They call that unconditional positive regard. And so when you see this full spectrum of possible behavior, you really do see what you're working with. You're in this kind of exploration mode where you're figuring out what you have in terms of the other person's behavior. Of course, people are trying to put their best foot forward when they are in courtship mode, but you're also rewarding somebody for divulging and disclosing anything about themselves. And so I think that later on in the relationship, things like punishment, abuse, and neglect can prune away stuff that people don't like. So let's say that you get somebody who you think is really good value. What we say in evolutionary psychology is like really good mate value. What's the optimal thing to do if you get a catch, if you get somebody way, way better than you are in terms of relationship? Well, what you want them to do is not advertise to anyone else that they're any good. And so I think this is what we're often seeing in abusive and relationships, is that somebody's being punished for simply advertising their good qualities. And that's what people will do if they want to hold on to a mate, is that they not only make that person feel like they have nowhere else to go and nothing to do in terms of other possible mates, but they also punish them for engaging in any kind of signaling of their good kind of mate qualities. Kind of going back to memory for others' preferences, in dyads, women are better at selecting gifts, as I said, and women are also better at selecting gifts for unknown people. So this goes back to this, women's better memory preferences as well. And one last thing I'll speculate on here in terms of like training is borderline personality disorder. So maybe you guys are familiar with borderline personality disorder. It's very common in women. There's been a kind of redefinition of borderline personality disorder where they talk about men having it. People say Donald Trump has it. I think that you'd have to really warp the definition of it to make men have the same amount of borderline personality disorder as women. But anyway, borderline personality disorder, it's called borderline because it's on the border between a personality disorder, something like, narcissism or psychopathy personality disorder, and actually like a full-blown, mental disorder. Something like schizophrenia, right? So it can really cause a lot of problems, but it's still called a personality disorder. So it's more common in women. These women generally are considered, pretty attractive. And even though I don't remember the exact percentage of borderline women in the population, men are actually much more likely to come across them, or a few of them, in dating, because they tend to have very short relationships and they tend to get into relationships very quickly and with very strong like romantic tendencies. Oftentimes, borderline personality disorder gets better as women get older. But it seems to me like a disorder of training. It seems to me like you turn the dial up on what normal women do to men in relationships to like 11. So there's idealization and devaluation. One minute they're telling you that you're like a god, and the next minute they're telling you like you're a literal piece of shit. There's this emotional volatility, sadness, happiness, romantic inclination, incredibly sensitive to abandonment, which is one of the main things I think that women punish as any cues that their mate might leave them. There's this hyperactive mentalizing, so constantly thinking about what other people might be trying to do with regards to them, very much like a kind of egocentric view about what other people are trying to do to them. And then positive reinforcement. The idea here is that if somebody's always being sort of difficult and aggressive to you, then when they're nice to you, it's going to feel even better. So let's say a woman with borderline personality disorder, or any woman, has a constantly sort of like -1 on a scale of -5 to +5. She's slightly shitty and bitchy to you all the time. Then punishment's going to feel much, much better to you than if she's like at a 0. So I think that this can be a very effective strategy. Because it does make the reinforcement feel much better. And also for many people, stressful situations, even if that stress is manufactured in the relationship, can actually bring people much closer together. So a few little conclusions. Basically, I think we evolved to use behaviorist techniques in order to shape others. And I think that we try and get people to do what we want. And what we want is, people to facilitate our adaptive strategies, prevent conflict with those adaptive strategies. Those things are really going to vary somewhat from person to person. We remember other people's preferences and aversions, what elicits pleasure and pain, in order to create a customized way of training them or shaping them. I think women might be better at shaping others than men are. Women have a lot more skin in the game when it comes to shaping others ancestrally than men did. There's arms races against shaping by others. I think that people defy shaping. They're very sensitive to whether or not they're being manipulated. And I think that this is one of the main reasons that we're not always consciously aware of engaging this behavior. And I think that conflict, abuse, and neglect can be seen through this like lens of the evolved trainer. So I'll just give you a few little take-home messages, and then I will wind up. So a few little take-home messages. I think the most cynical interpretation of your own behavior is often true. This is Littlefinger. It says, when I try to understand a person's motives, I play a little game. I assume the worst. What's the worst reason they could possibly have for saying what they say and doing what they do? And sometimes I think it can be helpful to have an outside view of yourself that is pretty cynical about what your motivations are in order to really figure yourself out. And people are obviously averse to this. Nobody wants to think that they're a bad person. But in my personal philosophical view, only by understanding kind of how bad a person evolution made you can you really succeed in bettering yourself and becoming a better person. So I think that understanding our evolved psychology can help us to be more mindful and change ourselves more effectively. One example of this is something called sexual overperception bias. Men are more likely to think that women who are simply being friendly are sexually interested in them. And I think this is a very helpful thing for men to understand because it helps them to be less wrong in their ideas about what women want and how much likelihood they have in dating somebody, for example. So when we're aware of these biases, I think it can be helpful. I don't have to tell that to this crowd. Your attachment to your identity is a means of counter control. We're all really attached to who we are right now. If you think about when you were a teenager and your parents were trying to change you, that's, I think, when we get most into counter control against our parents when we were teenagers. And really, who you are now is a mixture of your history, including how much other people tried to change your behavior, all your environmental history, and your genetics. And who you are is not in any way kind of sacred. So I think that this is a way that we try to resist control from other people is by really prioritizing who we are now. And saying, we have this endowment effect. The endowment effect is like, if I give you a coffee mug, before I gave it to you, you might say it was worth $4. But after you own it, you'd say it was worth like $7. We're very attached to our personality and who we are right now. And so I think that that's why I get some pushback on this idea that people are trying to control each other is because of this attachment that people have. And we have our attention and behavior being hacked by behaviorist techniques, but they're often used to sell products or keep us on social media or addict us to video games or whatever. And we feel like we're in control because we're choosing those things. So just an idea about how mindful should we be about how much other people are controlling us and how open to that should we be? Is it the worst thing in the world? Is it unethical if there is some control, especially if it helps us work towards our goals? I think that long-term interpersonal punishment is usually pointless and often counterproductive. I've had this experience in my life as well. If you hold a grudge against somebody for a long time, or they get a full day of silent treatment, someone gets a full day of silent treatment when they do any little thing wrong, that's usually pointless. So the other person can feel really, really terrible, but it's often counterproductive. So in behaviorism, there's this idea called an escape behavior. And when you give somebody long punishments after they do some behavior that you don't like, when the initial punishment that you gave them that happened as close to the behavior as possible, if you can get close to the behavior, was actually the most effective thing. And the longer you linger with punishment, the more an escape behavior of not considering what you say or not caring about what you think, it becomes effective. So I think over time, people really degrade the influence they have on others by engaging in kind of gratuitous punishment. Just because your evolved trainer or whatever thinks that you should leverage more punishment against somebody that they deserve more punishment, it actually isn't necessarily going to help you get what you want. And it might make that person more immune to your influence in the future. And in that same vein, if you often consider how you would effectively try to change someone's behavior, you can figure out it's not worth the effort. So people tend to punish things that are really not, at all sensitive to punishment. So for example, my husband has pretty bad autobiographical memory. He forgets things a lot. And I decided that it was really important to me that he remembered stuff. So, but every time I punished him, every time I got angry with him for not remembering something, that wasn't actually going to get me what I wanted. What I was actually training him to do was to not talk about whether or not he didn't remember something. I wasn't training him to better remember things. It wasn't like if something happened, he'd think, I should really remember this so that my wife doesn't get angry with me later for forgetting it. So what I started doing was having him tell me a story about stuff that happened during the day, like, over the course of our honeymoon, for example. I had him tell me, okay, tell me all of your favorite things that happened today. Because I know that one of the main reasons that I remember things very well is because I rehearsed in my head how I'm going to tell the story to other people. I'm very storytelling kind of ape person. And so I knew that if I influenced him in that way, that he would be able to remember things better. And it actually, I knew that punishment wasn't going to influence his memory in the way that I wanted. So if you see a behavior and you think, okay, I'd like, my partner to play, I don't know, less video games or watch less television or eat better food or whatever. If you think about just simply punishing them, that actually can be pretty easy, but usually ineffective. And so if you consider other ways to shape their behavior, sometimes you'll decide it's not worth the effort. And I think about, one of the examples that I use in the book is, if you have a garden, you can just leave kind of a wild patch, like a patch that has no cultivation whatsoever, a patch with wildflowers, and you have to sometimes decide that you're going to leave some of the people that you love just wild, so that you're going to relinquish control. And finally, I think that, if you think from an evolutionary perspective, I think we're feeling emotions we don't understand to solve some ancestral problems that no longer exist in ways that undermine our goals and our relationships. So I think that oftentimes when women and men get angry with each other about various things, anything from infidelity to overspending to not remembering important things or being thoughtless, we are reacting to those things as if it's a matter of life and death. Women reacting to scenarios where a man doesn't remember to call them, as if it's a matter of life and death, because I think it was a matter of life and death at one point. And it's just important to take a step back and think about, how important is it really? How important are these emotions really? And, what are they for? And I think that they can help us become more rational people. That's it.
Oh, thank you so much. That was really interesting. Imagine everyone clapping. I can already tell from the questions that you've hit some important spots of things people think about, I'm sure. So how about I first hit you with an easy one, and I'll hit you with a hard one. Easy question. When's the book coming out?
Yes. A when?
Yes.
I don't know. I actually, I'm still writing sample chapters now. I would think probably in a year or a year and a half, something like that.
All right. Okay, and now let's try a more difficult one. Where does the training end and infringement on personal agency begin?
That is kind of what I was talking about when I said that people hold their identities sacred. What is personal infringement? I definitely talked to some rationalist kinds of people who were super horrified by some of the ideas in this book as an infringement of personal agency. And I don't, if you think that these things are personal infringement, using Twitter or getting on your email are also personal infringement. It's really up to you. And definitely people, some men especially, I think, are very averse to any kind of control. And I've seen the women that they're with, the way that they really obliquely try and address how they want to change their behavior because of counter control. But yeah, I cannot answer that question.
All right, that's fair enough. Timothy Liptrot asks, say I am a straight man assessing partners. How do I predict the person's training strategies during courtship? Maybe select an emotional ability? Women differ a lot. So when I had a friend of mine read the what parts of the book that I've written now, she told me that I needed to put in some stuff for very agreeable women who, instead of punishing things and rewarding things when they see them, they tend to bottle these things up and then talk about them much later when it's not at all effective. So if you don't want somebody to control you at all,
Generally, agreeable women are less interested in control than disagreeable women are, and more women are agreeable. But it's actually very difficult to tell during courtship. So you might have to interview an ex-boyfriend or talk to her about her previous relationships. I've interviewed ex-girlfriends before. I'm not averse to that. So I think that, women do have somewhat different training strategies, and they all have their kind of bitter pills. A woman who's very agreeable, she might just bring up everything in one go that's bothered her for like the last month. In the way that's very, very ineffective.
All right. Operation Dios asks, can we train ourselves with these techniques? And Benny Falkovich adds onto that, can this sort of training work consciously? E.g., if I ask my wife to reinforce behaviors in me that I want.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best ways to get stuff that you like, behaviors that you want out of other people, is to if you want to become like a certain person and you want somebody to help you, you can specifically lay out, yes, reinforce me for this behavior or punish me for that behavior. I haven't had that much success with that because actually my husband's very untrainee. So I actually hired somebody to train me, like to get my word count and things in every day. Because when I asked my husband to, he would like just simply forget, or like he wouldn't be able to leverage the consequences against me that I had asked for. Because he likes me too much, I guess. I don't know. So you can ask people to help you with these things, and I think it can be really, really good. What was the first part of the question?
It was the same thing. It was just the question of, can we do it ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, it is really hard to not wriggle out of your own punishments. So I've used many different apps. I use Rescue Time and I use Freedom, and I try and constrain my own behavior in various different ways. And I also try and think about, what are my goals and what am I going to get if I get those goals finished? And generally, we escape from our own Skinner boxes too easily. I'm very surprised at, I think William said something like this, that we need Skinner boxes. I am really surprised that they haven't really been invented and that people don't use them.
Henry George asks, women seem more likely to end up entranced to a guru in 60s-style cults. Does this go against women being better trainers?
Entranced by a guru. I think that the entrancement from a guru is really, you think about like Greek mythology and all these young women who fall in love with gods. I think that, so hypergamy is the tendency to like want somebody who's higher in status than you. And it's a red pill concept, but it's also an evolutionary psychology concept. It's one of the evolutionary psychology concepts that red pill people tend to get mostly right. And so I think that the entrancement with guru is simply just like a hypergamy. It's women have hypergamy somewhat more than men do. And I think that's really a manifestation of that.
All right. Abdo El Nakori, I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly, asks, presumably, the more powerful people become, the less they need to pay attention to the preferences of others. People naturally placate to the powerful and do their bidding. I'd be interested to hear Dr. Fleischman's thoughts on this. Maybe this has implications for leadership, etc. Yeah,
so people do tend to do what powerful people want, or people who, they tend to want to make that person happy. And there's also, I don't know why this reminds you of this right away, but I'll tell you. There's this whole theory. So in monkeys, the higher status males, oftentimes the lower status males will literally bend over for the higher status males. And to me, people are always talking about this like as a subservient gesture, but in a very important way, the subservient male is also changing the alpha's behavior. He's rewarding him for not beating him up. Instead, he's having sex with him. And he's changing his behavior to something that's like not aggressive. And when people do reward each other and punish each other in hierarchies, there's less, a subservient can't punish somebody higher up than them as overtly. And you see this in kind of more traditional relationships as well. If a woman wants to punish a man, she has to do so very obliquely. I'm not giving you quite as much attention as I usually do. I gave you a smaller portion of food, whatever. It can be very, very subtle. So I think that you do see that in status hierarchies. And it's interesting when people talk about hierarchies and whether or not someone's doing what somebody else wants, they don't think about that necessarily as an infringement of personal liberty because they're aware of what's going on, as opposed to something like a more a subterfuge of reinforcement and punishment, which you might not be as aware of. Yeah. Simping.
Do you have any words on simping?
I really don't get it.
Well, I guess that's
nice to you because they have some like romantic interest in you. Like that's a normal thing, isn't it?
Well, further research necessary. Oliver Daniel asks, what happens with trained behavior outside or in between relationships? Do we rewire or unlearn the behavior?
Yeah, this is very interesting. So I think that what people often call baggage is just, stuff that's left over, like training that's left over from a previous relationship. So let's say that somebody, I'll give a personal example because I can't think of any other example. I'm like very much a lark. I go to bed at like 10 or 10:30 at night. I wake up at 6 or 6:30 in the morning. And my husband's an owl. He stays up super late. And I don't really care that he stays up late. In fact, I think it's good that we have a few hours apart every night. But his ex-wife was very much like a lark supremacist. She thought that being a lark was like much better than being an owl. And most people who are lark supremacists. They think that larks are like intrinsically better than owls are, right? And so I noticed that like if I even said anything, I'm like, oh, how late were you up? He's like, none of your business. He's really, really sensitive about me asking him about how late he was up. And I was just kind of asking out of personal curiosity. It wasn't really a behavior that I was that interested in changing. And so I think that somebody can become very sensitive to certain punishments and certain rewards because of previous relationships. And there's a certain kind of confidence interval in terms of how much somebody can change between relationships. But yeah, that's basically what I think baggage is kind of this holdover from being potentially overpunished.
All right. William Costello asks, how does this sit in relation to the ineffectiveness of things like violent video games and pornography influencing rates of violence or sexual violence?
So I think that the context, if you're playing a violent video game, is very constrained in terms of that behavior. It doesn't seem like real life, and it doesn't really have I think power over your real behavior in real life. I think that if we had video games that you were actually walking around in 3D, moving your muscles, it might actually have a different effect than what I think violent video games. I think William? What did he say? Violent video games, and what was the other thing? And violent pornography or violent?
Yeah, both. There's both pornography and video games.
Yeah, I do think that you can develop like a attachment or arousal to certain kinds of things if they've been paired enough times. But yeah, I do think that the violent video games and violent pornography, you're actually not getting rewarded for doing the seeking behaviors. So you're getting rewarded at the end point, that you're getting rewarded for actually observing the stimuli. But the behavior itself is just logging on. It actually doesn't take you through every step that you need to do those things in real life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Benny Falkovich asks, how would you distinguish between variation driven by being hard to unlock and variation that is just a random side effect of our psychological history?
Yeah, I can't.
Well, all right, okay, fair.
I just am very struck by how unusual people are. There's also some degree of cultural variation here, a lot of cultural variation here. So I think in the United States, it seems like the culture is designed for counter control. So I think some of the aversion to the idea that there are sex differences, or even that we can be categorized, as in a specific group or even a specific sex is forms of counter control that we don't want to be able to be easily categorized, because that would enable people to more easily predict our behavior. And you see a lot of divergence, people talking about how unusual their interests are or how difficult they are to predict. Whereas I think an Indian friend of mine told me that in India, one compliment you can give somebody is to tell them that they are simple. That is, that they are simple to predict and that they are simple to understand. And I think that if you told someone they were simple to predict and simple to understand in the West, people would be offended by that. So it is an interesting contrast, I think, between these different cultures. I think if our greatest cultural norm or our cultural value would be that other people could easily predict us, then we would see a lot less of this divergence, variation in preferences.
All right, Vincent Lee asks, this is, I think, in regards to the punishing the rat, even so it's not responsible for the damage or the electrocution. Are type 1 errors still more costly in cultures where you might kill others as punishment?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that if we were in a culture where most people here in the West have very limited experience with being beaten up or aggressed against, I think if you had extensive experience with people beating you up, you might not consider punishing somebody randomly as the kind of error that you want to bias yourself towards. I think if you were a woman who was with a man who regularly beat you or whoever threatened to kill you, you also would probably not just randomly punish him because you thought it might be a good idea at the time, because that would become a much more costly error. So I agree that it could have something to do with your experience. Certainly in cases where you have children or whatever, randomly punishing them, unfortunately, I think is generally what people are inclined to do. Although there's all these parenting techniques that are different now, where people think that one shouldn't punish one's children, even though everyone does.
Right. I think this is a easy question, but still worth asking. Is the pleasure and fun of sex evolution's incentive to make us reproduce more readily with less rational reflection?
I'm sorry, I was reading somebody asking me if people should avoid being nagged by beating their wives. I'm not going to do it. You're not going to catch me out on that.
Fair enough.
Repeat your question. I'm so sorry.
Yes, of course. Is the pleasure and fun of sex evolution's incentive to make us reproduce more readily with less rational reflection?
Oh yeah. There's a whole book called Why Is Sex Fun? And people, sex in almost every species, even in species that I think release their eggs, it seems like they're enjoying themselves. Even just releasing your gametes into water, feels nice. And so if you can really build on that as a reward mechanism. And I've written 2 papers on sex kind of being used in this, working from this adaptation. So if you already have sex, then you might as well co-opt it to reward other kinds of behaviors and to reinforce a pair bond, or even to reinforce normal social bonds. I think that's the main reason why we see so much bisexuality in our species, is because sex is being used to reward social bonds. Similarly, you can think about disgust, originally evolved for avoiding toxins in food or disease. And then it was co-opted to show your displeasure or ostracize people who were immoral.
Right. Benny Falkovich asks, could emotional reticence in men be an evolved response to be less trainable?
Yeah, I think that we have this idea that women like vulnerable men, but women do have hypergamy. And so when women are constantly saying, oh, I want to know your vulnerabilities, I want to know all the worst things about you, it's, I think a way of trying to figure out what is the worst aspects of your mate value? What's the worst things about you? I'd like to know those things so I can figure out if I'm going to reject you or not. And men are reluctant to divulge, because as much as culture and society and women tell them your vulnerability is very attractive to us, I think men know better that certain kinds of vulnerability are attractive and certain kinds are really not. You know, it's as much as I hate to give Red Pill any props, they do have some things right, and I think that that's one of them. Unfortunately, I think they make it sound like all of the ways that we evolved, all of our evolved inclinations are because we evolved them necessarily good, and I'm saying that they're not. I also think, yes, reticence can be a form of counter control. If you don't let people know what they're like, then it's because you can be controlled less easily that way. And if you're careful about being controlled. I'll just kind of go on a brief a little story that these people that I know have children, and they're very psychologically sophisticated. They're both psychologists, and they don't actually discipline their kids at all or train them at all. Their kids are pretty wild. And when it came down to it, they told me that they thought that their kids would be more controllable by others. You know, that it was good that their kids were kind of doing whatever they wanted because it made them less controllable. I think that there's lots of people who do whatever their mothers and fathers say and who end up in prison or engaging in bad behavior otherwise. But it is a kind of interesting example of how people think, okay, I'm going to show very little obedience or not train somebody so that they can be less sensitive to the training of others.
Mr. R asks, is bisexuality even that rare amongst animals?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on, yeah, it is really. I mean, gorillas, there's like only a couple cases. There's a really good paper by Paul Vasey, which just looks at primates. I mean, fish do all kinds of weird things. There's like hermaphroditic fish and they can change sex and stuff, right? So it's difficult to say, like, is that a bisexual fish? But there's a whole survey of primates, some of which only engage in bisexual interaction in captivity, some of which engage in it all the time, like bonobos. Gorillas, I think there's only one case of a male having sex with males and females. Gorilla females really have nothing to do with each other. So if you look at like just primates, then it's a minority. It's not tiny, but they're mostly not bisexual.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go right ahead.
Yes. I'm Salah. I want to ask you about the idea of changing the behavior for a human. And how is this have a conflict with the idea of free will?
I don't believe in free will.
Fair enough. All right, maybe like one more questions before we head out to the breakout rooms. Anyone have one more question for us?
Yeah, this is Noah. I was just wondering about the birds. You mentioned these scientists taking away this male bird for an extra half hour.
Yeah.
And the female changing her duet. I was wondering if a similar behavior happened if you took the male would do a similar behavior if you took away the female for longer.
I think that it's possible that would happen. All these bird studies that I looked at, they were always testing to see how much the male can anticipate the female's food preferences, what the female does if the male is kept away longer. But they are a monogamous species, at least during the breeding season. So it would make sense for them to both reciprocally want to change one another's behavior. So I do think that you'd see a similar change in male behavior if they kept the female away. Unfortunately, they didn't do that. It actually sounded like a very complicated study to do.
All right. Well, Diana, thank you so much for your time. This was really great. I love following you and your husband on Twitter. You guys have some of the most interesting takes that I both agree and disagree with. I also invite everyone now to unmute themselves and clap so we can actually hear our clap. All right, so the party isn't over though. We are now going to head into breakout rooms. Diana, you're of course invited to come as well if you are interested, where we will go into a little bit of smaller groups and talk about whatever we want to. So I have now posted the link in the chat, which will show you several Jitsi links Pick whichever one sounds good to you, and I'll see you guys there.
The Hey, hi, how's it going? Is it the two of us?
We are moving to the Jitsi rooms, actually. I can post a link again for anyone who hasn't seen it, but that is where the conversations will continue. We can have a little bit smaller groups. It's a little more intimate. Of course, you can stay here too if you really wanted to and make the secret room. I'm not going to stop you, but this is the official way of doing it. Wonderful.
Good. I can't see myself anymore, but guess I'm here.